When Swim stood at the podium, draped in her black designer coat and perfectly powdered grief, I expected a eulogy. Something about Rick's bravery, his dedication to country, his smile. But what she said instead was a scalpel disguised as sorrow. If he hadn't been so busy taking care of his mother, she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound rehearsed, maybe he wouldn't have been so exhausted that day. Maybe he would have seen the signal. Maybe, just maybe, he'd still be here. Every eye in the church turned to me. I was frozen in the second pew, one trembling hand on my cane and the other clenched in my lap. 76 years old, grieving the loss of my only son, and somehow still managing to be the villain in my daughter-in-law's tragedy. Rick was gone. A military pilot, top in his unit. He died in a crash during what they called a classified mission. That's all they would tell me. No more. I wasn't allowed to know where, or why, or how exactly. Just that his body had been recovered and flown back in a flag-draped coffin. But Swim, short for Swindell, though she always introduced herself with a theatrical little pause, as if waiting for applause, didn't need answers. She'd found her culprit. And apparently, it was me. I didn't speak at the service. Not because I didn't have words, Lord, I had thousands, but because I knew better than to battle a widow in a room full of mourners. Especially one who had been clawing at my place in Rick's life since the day they married. She stepped off the stage with measured steps, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor, and brushed past me like I was furniture. Didn't look at me. Didn't even stop when she muttered, "The insurance money's going to me. All of it. You don't deserve a dime." It wasn't her grief talking. It was her. Swim had always wanted Rick to cut ties with me. She hated that he called every day, drove over with groceries, paid for my prescriptions when my legs gave out and I couldn't walk to the store. To her, those things were distractions. Weaknesses. She called it emotional babysitting. I called it family. When I got home from the funeral, I sat in Rick's favorite recliner, still wrapped in the scent of his cologne, and stared at the wall for hours. 100 memories bubbled up like boiling water. His kindergarten graduation, his first plane ride, the time he brought me homemade cookies after my hip replacement. He'd always been my protector. My boy. And now Swim wanted to erase that. But here's what she didn't know. That night, I made a call. To an old friend, David Costa, now working private security and investigations. A quiet man with a sharp mind and no patience for bullies. "Ginger," he said, his voice low and firm, "tell me everything you know. I'll find out what really happened." Because I no longer believed it was fatigue that took my son out of the sky. Not anymore. David Costa showed up 2 days later. He didn't knock, just rapped twice on the door and walked in like he had a right to. I appreciated that. He was the only person who hadn't offered me pity since the crash. No hushed condolences, no casseroles wrapped in foil. Just a leather briefcase, a stack of NDAs, and a folder labeled Rick Holloway, initial inquiry. I pulled what I could, he said, laying the folder on my coffee table like it was made of glass. It's not much yet. The mission was scrubbed of most data. But the crash report, it doesn't sit right with me. I opened the folder with hands that didn't feel like mine. Inside were grainy black and white images from satellite captures, GPS maps, a maintenance log, and something else, notes written in David's tight, military-style handwriting. Rick shouldn't have been flying that day, David said. His flight record shows he logged 86 hours in the last month. The threshold for his unit is 65. He was overworked. But not by you, Ginger. He leaned forward. His unit commander mentioned in passing that Rick had been under a lot of emotional strain. But that detail? It was redacted in the formal report. I want to know why. My heart beat hard in my chest. Swim said he was always exhausted, I whispered. That helping me drained him. She said. She's lying. David cut in. I checked his call logs. He called you once every 3 days. Never during duty hours. No long visits recorded at his base. He paused, then pulled out a sealed envelope. This is from a tech sergeant who bunked near Rick. He says Rick and Swim were fighting. Bad. Yelling matches over video calls. 3 times, Rick slept in his hangar. And here's the kicker, she called his base over 20 times in the last 2 months. jealous rants, suspicion about other women. One time she accused his commanding officer, a 60-year-old married man, of covering up an affair. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. "I want to meet the sergeant," I said instead. David nodded. "Already arranging it. But there's more." He clicked a button on his tablet and turned the screen toward me. It was a voicemail. Rick's voice, hoarse, tired, and slow. "Hey Mom, just wanted to say I'm okay. I know Swim's been acting strange. She keeps threatening to make things difficult if I don't stop calling you. I'm not going to stop. But I'm thinking about talking to a lawyer. If anything happens to me, just know I love you." My hand flew to my mouth. I had never heard that message. It had been blocked, intercepted, probably deleted from my phone by someone who had access. David tapped the screen. "We'll trace the origin. But this isn't fatigue, Ginger. It's targeted stress. Psychological warfare. Swim turned your son's home into a minefield." It was then I realized this wasn't just about grief. It was about justice. And I would drag the truth into the light if it was the last thing I did. David stood. "I'll keep digging. But I suggest you lawyer up. Because when I'm done, that insurance money, she won't see a penny." And just like that, I wasn't just a grieving mother anymore. I was a woman with a cause. By the following Monday, I had hired a lawyer. A real pit bull named Elise Tran, mid-40s, sharp bob haircut, known for her absolute annihilation of shady inheritance claims. When I told her what Swim said at the funeral, she didn't flinch. "She's already weaponizing guilt," Elise said. "But it won't hold in court. What I need is motive, and you've already got a breadcrumb trail thanks to Mr. Costa." David Costa was still digging. Every night he'd email me a new nugget, recordings, screenshots, contact names. Swim was unraveling fast. One of the recordings was from a neighbor. Swim had called her over in a rage 3 weeks before Rick's crash. She accused Rick of cheating again and smashed his phone on their kitchen counter, loud enough that the neighbor heard it through the wall. That same night, Rick had booked a hotel room nearby. Paid in cash. "You ever wonder why he never told you any of this?" Elise asked, not unkindly. "He didn't want to worry me," I said. "He always protected me, even when I didn't need it." She nodded. "Then let's protect him now." By Friday, we had enough to draft a motion to freeze the insurance distribution. The policy clearly stated it would be split 50-50 between spouse and next of kin, unless one party could be shown to have contributed to the death through mental or emotional coercion leading to unsafe conduct. That clause was rare. But it was real. And now it was mine. The next step was confrontation. We invited Swim for tea. She showed up in oversized sunglasses, as if mourning were something you accessorized. Not a single word of greeting. Just stomped in, arms crossed, suspicious. "What is this about?" she asked, voice sharp, eyes darting from me to Elise. I smiled. Just slightly. "I just wanted to clear the air," I said. "Rick would have wanted peace between us." "Oh please," she said, pulling off her sunglasses. "He's dead. And nothing's going to change that." "No," Elise said smoothly. "But the circumstances of his death are currently under legal review." Swim went still. "Elise is my lawyer," I said. "We've requested a stay on the insurance payout. There's concern about undue emotional distress inflicted by the spouse." "That would be you." She laughed. Loud. Ugly. "You're kidding." "No," Elise said, sliding a folder across the table. "This is a list of documented incidents, witnesses, audio recordings, financial behavior. It paints a pretty clear picture of harassment, obsessive behavior, psychological abuse. And it puts the cause of Rick's mental decline in a different light." Swim's face drained of color. "You think this will hold up?" she snapped. "I think it's already holding," Elise said. "And if you choose to challenge it, everything will come out in court. Including Rick's voicemails, his hotel receipts, and your calls to his commanding officer accusing him of affairs." Swim's lips parted, but no words came out. "You tried to destroy me at my son's funeral," I said softly. "Now I'm just returning the favor. Legally." She stood so fast her chair scraped the floor. "This isn't over," she hissed. But I knew something she didn't. It already was. Swim didn't waste any time. By Monday morning, Elise forwarded me a copy of the counter-motion Swim filed, claiming I was interfering with a widow's rightful compensation. She painted herself as the grieving spouse being attacked by a jealous, bitter mother-in-law. She even called me unstable. Elise laughed out loud reading that part. Classic projection, she said. We'll counter with facts. Meanwhile, David Costa was still on the trail. He'd contacted one of Rick's former commanding officers, a man named Colonel Dane Harlow, now retired. It took a few phone calls and a promise of confidentiality, but Harlow agreed to speak with me privately. We met at a diner just outside the base perimeter, the kind that served bottomless coffee and still played 60s rock on crackling speakers. He arrived in a worn leather jacket, face carved by years of sun and war, but his eyes were sharp as ever. "You're Ginger Holloway," he said, sliding into the booth. "I knew your boy. Damn fine pilot." "Thank you," I whispered. "He didn't die because of fatigue," Harlow said without ceremony. "Not the kind that comes from flying too much." I blinked. Then what? He was distracted. Rattled. He'd never admit it, but he was off his game. I had to ground him once for missing a pre-flight check. Rick Holloway missing a check? That man could recite protocols in his sleep. He paused, then pulled a slip of paper from his wallet. This was found in his locker the week before the crash. It was a handwritten note, scrawled in my son's blocky handwriting. "Can't take the screaming anymore. Starting to hate going home. I'm losing sleep. Losing focus. I'm scared I'll screw something up." My breath hitched. He never reported abuse, the colonel said. But he didn't have to. We knew. Hell, his squad knew. Swim called the base so often we had to change the protocol for call routing. And one night, Rick left base unauthorized. Just drove. No word. When he came back, he looked like a man trying to hold his soul together with duct tape. My hands were trembling. "Do you think she contributed to the crash?" "I think," Harlow said, leaning forward, "if she had kept her mouth shut and her claws off him, Rick would still be alive." It was the final nail. I gave the note to Elise. She didn't say a word, just slid it into the case file like loading a bullet into a chamber. Later that night, as I stood in Rick's empty bedroom, I looked at the medals on his shelf, the photos of him in uniform, the smiling boy who once built me a birdhouse from popsicle sticks. "I'm coming for her, baby," I whispered. "And I'll make sure the world knows who you really were." Swim's next move was as vile as it was predictable. She leaked a short video clip to Rick's military alumni network, just enough to stir whispers. In it, Rick is seen rubbing his eyes in a dark room, his voice low and tired. "I don't know how much longer I can take this. It's all too much. My mom, she needs me. But Swim, she says I'm choosing her over my wife." Swim's caption? Proof. His mother was draining him. "My husband is dead because she couldn't let go." It spread like wildfire among base families and veterans forums. Swim was winning sympathy. For a few days, the tide turned. But David Costa had already intercepted the full version of the video, the one Swim had edited. In the full clip, Rick continues. "But I love my mom. She's all I've got left that makes sense. Swim keeps screaming that I'm cheating, but all I do is sleep at the hangar when she throws things. She says she's going to tell people I'm unstable. I don't know what's worse, being tired or being terrified at home." The last word is whispered. Terrified. David sent the uncut footage to Elise, who subpoenaed the original file metadata and had it verified by a tech expert. We were ready to drag that digital dagger into court. But what came next we hadn't expected. One of Swim's ex-friends, a woman named Kaylee, reached out anonymously through Elise's office. She had a flash drive. And on it? Recordings of Swim boasting about how she planned to crush Rick's mother after his death. One audio file had her laughing. "She thinks she'll get insurance money? I'll make sure she's blamed for Rick's crash. She'll crawl back into her one bedroom and rot there with her charity furniture." But the worst file was a video Swim didn't know Kaylee had taken. It showed Swim on a drunken night ranting to a small group of women. She thinks he was tired because of her? He was tired because I wouldn't let him sleep. I'd set alarms to wake him. I'd accuse him of cheating. If he looked at a waitress too long, I'd scream for hours. He once cried in the shower. Like a child. She laughed at that. She laughed. We had motive. We had method. And now we had character assassination, in her own voice, by her own hand. Elise watched the videos with her arms crossed, face unreadable. Then she looked at me and said one word. War. The court hearing was scheduled. Elise filed a formal challenge for the full insurance payout, $840,000, citing psychological abuse, reckless endangerment, and emotional coercion leading to fatal fatigue. The judge accepted the motion to freeze the distribution pending a full evidentiary review. Swim's lawyer was a man named Trent Fallon. He had slicked back hair and an oily grin, the kind of man who mistook cruelty for cleverness. The morning of the hearing, he walked past me outside the courthouse and gave me a mocking smile. "You ready to lose what's left of your reputation?" he said under his breath. I looked him dead in the eye. "I buried my son with my bare hands," I replied. "I've already lost everything that matters. This part? This is survival." Inside the courtroom, the drama was clinical. Elise opened with Rick's military performance reports, sterling until the final 2 months before his death. That's when everything dipped: flight error rates, reprimands for inattentiveness, even a warning letter. He'd gone from star pilot to red flag risk in 6 weeks. Then came the medical report: high cortisol, insomnia, stress indicators. Rick had visited a military therapist twice, citing marital stress, but no follow-up had been scheduled due to scheduling gaps. Elise leaned into every point. Then she played the voicemail, the one Rick had sent me before his death but was wiped from my phone. In it, Rick says plainly, "She's making things impossible. I'm always walking on eggshells. I'm scared one of these days I'll miss something important at work. I'm scared I'll make a mistake I can't undo." The courtroom was silent. Even Swim's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. But it wasn't until Elise played the drunk video, Swim laughing about keeping Rick awake, mocking him for crying, that the air in the courtroom turned cold. Trent Fallon stood up, objecting. "This is a private, unverified recording. It's been authenticated," Elise interrupted. "And it shows intent, recklessness, and gross cruelty." The judge allowed it. Swim stared at the table. No tears. Just silence. When the session ended for the day, Elise leaned toward me and whispered, "We rattled her. Her defense is falling apart." And she was right. Outside the courthouse, reporters had already gathered. One military spouse whispered to another as Swim walked past, "That's the one who mocked her own husband for crying." She heard it. And for the first time I saw it. Fear. Not of me. Not of the court. But of the truth finally catching up to her. Swim's lawyers tried a last-ditch effort. They filed a motion claiming that the insurance policy should be honored as originally written, regardless of subjective moral context. In other words, they argued that no matter how awful Swim had been, Rick signed the policy naming her and his next of kin, and that's that. But Elise was ready. She brought up Clause 11.3, a rarely invoked section titled Negligence or Malice. It stated that if the death of the insured is proven to be influenced by extreme psychological distress caused by the beneficiary, payment to that beneficiary could be revoked pending court review. This clause had only been cited 4 times in 10 years. But never like this. We had to prove not just that Swim was a nightmare, but that her actions directly contributed to Rick's decline, enough that he made critical errors. Elise called David Costa to the stand. In his quiet, firm voice, David laid it all out. He presented logs showing Swim's 20-plus calls to Rick's base, many during sleep hours. Witnesses who overheard her screaming over the phone. Text messages full of paranoia and accusation. Surveillance video of her pacing outside his hotel at midnight after he left home to sleep in peace. Then came the therapist's unofficial notes, acquired through a personal favor and submitted with careful redaction. Rick had confided he was scared his mind was slipping, and he had thoughts of leaving both the marriage and the Air Force, just to have peace. That line hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Swim didn't speak. She didn't even look up. But Elise wasn't finished. She called me to the stand. I hadn't planned to testify. But Elise said my voice, the mother who was blamed, would seal the narrative. I took the oath. I sat down. And for the first time since Rick died, I spoke without shame. My son was tired, I said, voice shaking only at the start. But he wasn't tired because he was helping me carry groceries or fixing my porch light. He was tired because his home became a war zone. I paused. Rick called me every few days. Not for help. Not because I begged. But because he needed an anchor. Someone calm. Someone who wasn't screaming. I looked directly at Swim. My son didn't die because he was overworked. He died because he was emotionally tortured to the edge of his limits. And this woman, I pointed to her, slowly, tried to bury the truth with him. The judge didn't interrupt. No one did. When I stepped down, Elise whispered, that was the moment we won. By the time court resumed the following week, the whispers had grown louder. Military wives from Rick's squadron posted anonymously on support forums, sharing stories about Swim, how she berated him at social functions, how she once accused a female medic of flirting just for offering Rick a water bottle. One woman came forward directly. Her name was Sergeant Kelsey Rowland. She requested to testify under protective identity at first, but when she learned the full scope of the case, she chose to speak publicly. She took the stand in uniform, medals gleaming under courtroom lights. I was on call the night Captain Holloway crashed, she said, her voice clear. He reported to briefing late. Eyes red. Hands trembling. I asked if he needed to be grounded. He said no. He said, quote, I just need to finish this mission. I'll sleep after. Was that normal for him? Elise asked. No, ma'am, Kelsey said. He was one of the sharpest pilots I'd ever seen. But the last few weeks? Something changed. He seemed haunted. Then she turned toward the judge. I later found him alone in the locker room, crying. He apologized for it. Said he didn't know how to go home anymore without fighting. That he was afraid he'd miss something in the air because he couldn't stop thinking about her screaming. Kelsey's words landed heavy. Even Trent Fallon didn't rise for rebuttal. When court adjourned for the day, Swim stormed out of the room before the bailiff even announced the recess. I followed her, keeping distance, but watching. She barked into her phone the moment she hit the hallway. You were supposed to scrub that video. I paid you, she hissed, turning her back. David Costa caught my eye from down the hall. He gave me a small nod. He'd already started recording. Meanwhile, Elise was working behind the scenes. She'd filed a request with the insurance company to begin a temporary reassignment of the funds. Swim's share was frozen. But mine? Mine could be unlocked if the judge ruled she was no longer entitled. Swim must have found out because that night I received an envelope slid under my door. Inside was a letter. I'll make sure you're alone for the rest of your life. You'll lose your house. Your name. He died on your watch. You're just too old to realize it. She'd signed it. Swim. Just like that. She might as well have given us her confession. When Elise showed the letter to the court, the impact was immediate. Handwritten. Aggressive. And signed by the defendant. The judge raised his brow, clearly stunned by the audacity. I suppose there's no more ambiguity regarding her intentions, he said, scanning the document again. This isn't grief. This is malice. Trent Fallon didn't object. He couldn't. Swim was cornered. So he tried deflection. She's under immense emotional stress. Grief manifests in complicated ways. Elise shot that down in seconds. With all due respect, Your Honor, emotional stress does not override premeditated verbal abuse, documented manipulation, and a campaign of psychological warfare that contributed to a preventable military tragedy. This isn't complicated grief. It's character. Swim sat stone-faced, her eyes empty. When called to testify, she refused. Her lawyer whispered in her ear for several seconds, then finally stood. The defendant will invoke her right to remain silent. It was over. The judge, now visibly tired of the theatrics, took only 10 minutes in chambers before returning with his decision. Based on the overwhelming evidence of coercion, psychological abuse, and clear intent to harm both emotionally and financially, the court hereby revokes the beneficiary status of Swindell Holloway. The full insurance payout is granted to the remaining next of kin, Ginger Holloway. This ruling is effective immediately. There were gasps in the courtroom. I didn't cry. I simply exhaled slow and steady, as though I'd been holding my breath since the day the officer knocked on my door with the news of Rick's death. Swim didn't speak. She just stood up, slowly, clutching her designer bag like it might save her, and walked out with her heels echoing in the cold courtroom. No apology. No tears. No remorse. Just a defeated figure, fading into the background. Outside, reporters circled. They asked how I felt. What I'd do with the money. What message I had for other widowed military families. But I didn't answer any of that. I looked at the cameras and said one thing. My son didn't die from war. He died from cruelty disguised as love. Don't ignore the signs. And then I walked away. A week after the ruling, I finally went into Rick's attic. The military had returned a small shipment of his personal belongings, sealed crates labeled with serial numbers and shipping manifests. I hadn't touched them until now. I couldn't. But that morning, with the autumn sun slicing through the lace curtains and the air finally still, I felt ready. The first box held the expected uniforms, medals, photos from training exercises. A few flight logs. A broken wristwatch I'd given him when he first graduated flight school. I ran my fingers over the scratched glass. The second box was heavier. Inside were folders, notebooks, and a flash drive marked in Rick's handwriting for Mom if anything happens. I froze. David Costa came over that afternoon. We plugged the drive into his encrypted laptop and waited. A video loaded. Rick's face appeared. Pale, tired, but calm. Hey, Mom, he began. If you're watching this, it means something went wrong. He took a deep breath. I want you to know I never blamed you. For anything. You didn't ask me to help. I wanted to. Because I loved helping you. Because you were the only piece I had left. He looked off camera for a second, then back. Swim has been hard. I've tried. But she's paranoid. Accusatory. Violent at times. I didn't report it. My career couldn't afford the noise. But it's wearing me down. He paused again, visibly choking back emotion. If I ever don't come home, and she tries to twist that narrative, please fight it. Not for me, but for the truth. I don't want her rewriting my story. She doesn't get to win by default. I couldn't move. Couldn't speak. David reached over and stopped the video, his jaw set tight. That changes everything, he said. That's a man who knew he was on borrowed time. Elise later submitted a certified copy to the military's internal inquiry. They reopened their case. Within 48 hours, Swim received a dishonorable citation from the military's Spousal Support Board, a quiet but powerful black mark. She lost her housing privileges, her base access, and her social standing among the tight-knit military spouses. But I didn't celebrate. I simply burned a candle in front of Rick's photograph that night. I kept my promise, I told him. I told your story. Among the remaining contents in the box from Rick's attic was a weathered envelope with no stamp, just a name written in block letters. Adler. I didn't recognize it at first. But when I showed it to David, his eyes narrowed. Lieutenant Jamie Adler, he said. They flew together. Ground Operations Officer. The one who wasn't allowed to testify in the official inquiry. We opened the envelope. Inside were 10 typed pages, Rick's personal statement. Dated 3 weeks before his final flight. It detailed everything, the fights with Swim, the sleepless nights, the forced emotional performances he had to give on base just to avoid triggering a mandatory wellness evaluation. One line stood out. If something happens to me, Adler has the full truth. He promised to carry it if I couldn't. Elise made a call. Adler had been relocated, voluntarily, to a non-combat role overseas. But he responded immediately. 2 days later, he sent a video statement. I tried to speak up, he said. But they buried it. Said it would tarnish Rick's legacy. Said it was domestic, not military. But what they don't understand is that Rick was the mission. And when his mind started to crack, it wasn't because of war, it was because he was fighting it at home alone. He looked directly into the camera. His wife used words like weapons. She destroyed his rest, his confidence, his clarity. He should have been pulled from the schedule weeks before. But he was too proud, too loyal. He swallowed hard. And now he's dead. Adler's statement wasn't just powerful, it was admissible. Elise submitted it as post-trial evidence to the military tribunal reviewing Rick's fatality status. If successful, it would reclassify his death from pilot error to emotional interference. That change would not only set precedent, but permanently inscribe the truth into his official military file. Meanwhile, Swim's world continued to shrink. Her lawyer withdrew representation. Rumor was, he saw the flash drive. The court of public opinion had already judged her. Social media flooded with support for Rick's memory. Hashtags like #Justice for Captain Holloway and #Truth Matters trended on veteran pages. And Swim? She disappeared. She stopped returning messages. Moved out of her condo. Her social media went dark. But it didn't matter. Because even in silence, her fall echoed. Rick's story, his real story, was finally being told. A few weeks after Adler's testimony was accepted by the review board, I received a letter from the Department of the Air Force. They were formally reclassifying Rick's death. Due to verified and substantiated evidence of sustained emotional and psychological interference from a domestic source, the pilot's conduct during the mission is no longer deemed negligent. The incident has been amended from pilot error to compromised operational performance due to extenuating personal distress beyond reasonable control. The phrasing was clinical, but I understood what it meant. Rick wasn't to blame. They were preparing a revised service recognition, and they invited me to a small ceremony to honor Rick's service under the new designation. It was meant to be quiet, no cameras, just Rick's name and record being restored. But Swim caught wind of it. She tried to intervene. She called the base administrator and demanded the event be reviewed for appropriateness. She claimed it would reignite trauma and misrepresent the realities of their marriage. But the administrator had already seen the case file. He responded, simply, "The ceremony proceeds as planned. You are not on the invitation list." I arrived that morning in Rick's favorite blue-gray scarf, the one he'd bought me on his last trip home. Elise was beside me. David Costa stood in the back, arms folded, eyes always scanning, still watching over me. A quiet room. A folded flag. A colonel at the podium. And then they said it. For acts of perseverance and bravery, while under significant personal duress, Captain Richard Holloway is hereby recognized for his service with distinction. My hands trembled as I accepted the plaque. Not because I needed the medal, but because they were finally, acknowledging the war my son fought at home. Afterward, the colonel pulled me aside. "There's something else," he said. The original investigation team left out a file. It was in Rick's private locker. "We're sending it to your residence. It's marked for you." When it arrived the next day, I opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a sealed envelope marked, "Do not open unless you need to remember who you really are." It was in Rick's handwriting. I didn't open it. Not yet. Because for the first time in months, I didn't need the reminder. I already knew. Swim resurfaced 2 weeks later, but not in court. In an online article. The headline read, "I was demonized after my husband's death, now I'm ready to speak." It was published on a blog that trafficked in sensationalism, with a flashy banner and clickbait headlines. But it gained traction quickly. She painted herself as a scapegoat, a misunderstood military widow, villainized by a bitter, elderly woman with too much time and too many connections. She called Rick's posthumous reclassification a betrayal of his real legacy and accused me of twisting grief into a campaign of vengeance. The article was shared thousands of times. At first, I braced myself for public backlash. But then the comments rolled in. And Swim wasn't ready for what the world had to say. She laughed about waking him up to scream, "Don't forget the video." That woman was warned not to speak, and she did it anyway. The courts decided. She's just mad she lost the money and the narrative. Even former friends commented, exposing her manipulations. One woman wrote, "She once told me that if Rick died on duty, she'd never have to work again." I thought she was joking. I was wrong. Swim tried to backpedal. She posted a follow-up claiming her words had been taken out of context, but the damage was done. The blog removed the article within 48 hours after threats of a defamation lawsuit from Elise. And then Elise did something Swim hadn't expected. She filed a formal restraining order on my behalf. Not because Swim had physically threatened me, but because the letter, signed and delivered to my home, was now part of public court record. Combined with her public attempts to reignite a narrative already proven false, it qualified as targeted harassment. Swim was ordered to stay 500 feet away from my home and to have no digital contact. If she violated it, she'd be held in contempt of court. The silence that followed was thunderous. No more blogs. No more posts. No more interviews. Just emptiness. Because when you build your world on lies and the truth burns it down, there's nothing left to stand on. I didn't expect to hear from the military again. But a letter came, hand-delivered by courier, bearing the Air Force crest. It was from a chaplain. He said Rick had made an unusual personal request during his last mission cycle, one not listed on official forms. Apparently, Rick had written a document titled Contingency Directive, Personal Executor, Ginger Holloway. It wasn't legally binding, but it held emotional weight. It listed what he wanted to happen if he didn't come home. It wasn't about possessions. It wasn't about medals or honors. It was about his memory. The document was 5 pages long. Carefully written. Honest. Rick had feared that if he died, Swim would turn the narrative into something grotesque. That she'd speak louder, cry harder, dress sharper, until people believed whatever story she told. She's a master of optics, he wrote. She wins with volume. But Mom, you win with truth. He asked that if he died under suspicious or avoidable psychological burden, I speak to the Air Force Academy's training unit. He wanted future officers to learn how unseen battles, especially emotional ones, could ground even the strongest pilots. He wanted it added to a case study. A teaching tool. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Rick, even in death, was still trying to help someone else. I sent a copy to the academy. A month later, I was invited to speak. It wasn't a grand auditorium or televised memorial. It was a room of 40 young cadets, all in uniform, silent and attentive. I told them who Rick was. Not just the pilot. Not just the decorated officer. But the man who stayed late to help his mother with groceries. The one who volunteered for rescue flights on holidays. The one who was slowly broken not by war, but by the war waiting for him every time he stepped through his own front door. I finished with the words Rick left me. Love should never sound like screaming. And home should never feel like a minefield. No one clapped. Not out of rudeness, but out of reverence. A few cadets approached afterward. One with tears in her eyes said, "Ma'am, thank you for reminding us that strength sometimes means asking for help." And for the first time since that awful day, I felt Rick's presence not as pain, but as pride. He wasn't just remembered. He was teaching. The court ruling had been final, the insurance money legally awarded, the restraining order in place. But Swim wasn't done trying to claw something from the ashes. She filed an appeal, not to overturn the financial judgment, but to challenge the character findings in the ruling, attempting to strike the record of psychological abuse from the court's official language. Elise was furious. She doesn't care about the money anymore, she said. She cares about the narrative. She wants the record to say it wasn't her fault. She's trying to erase the truth. The appeal went to a higher court, but this time the judge was less patient. The clerk read Swim's filing aloud. The language used by the prior court decision unjustly portrays the appellant as emotionally harmful, without consideration for her own mental state during the events in question. But the judge had read the file. He knew better. He reviewed the video clips, the handwritten letter, the voicemail, and the flash drive testimony from Rick himself. And then he said something that will stay with me for the rest of my life. This court will not sanitize the past to comfort the guilty. The emotional harm inflicted by the appellant was real. The consequences were fatal. The record will remain intact because the truth is not negotiable. With that, he dismissed the appeal. Swim stood and tried to speak. Her voice cracked. For the first time, she didn't sound angry or arrogant. She sounded small. Please. I didn't mean for any of it to go this far. But it had. And there was no going back. Outside the courtroom, Elise handed me a copy of the decision signed, sealed, and stamped. "It's over," she said. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like justice. The hard, heavy kind. The kind that doesn't come with cheers or relief, but with silence. Peaceful, aching silence. I went home and pulled out the envelope I still hadn't opened. The one Rick left for me labeled, "Do not open unless you need to remember who you really are." That night, I sat alone by the fireplace, tea in hand, and opened it. Inside was a photograph. Rick and I, taken 5 years earlier, both of us laughing on the back porch. He had written on the back, "You were never a burden. You were always my reason. Don't let her steal that from you." I didn't cry. I simply held the photo to my chest and whispered, "I won't." And I meant it. When you take away the money and the mask, there's not much left. A few months after the appeal was denied, I got a call from Elise. "Swim filed for bankruptcy," she said flatly. Chapter 13. Looks like her debts have finally caught up. Turns out, while she was busy trying to control Rick's narrative, she'd been hemorrhaging money behind the scenes: lavish spending, missed mortgage payments, lawsuits from credit card companies. And without the insurance payout she counted on, everything collapsed. But the bankruptcy filings revealed something else. Swim had already started borrowing against the insurance money before the court case was resolved. She'd taken out 2 private loans and used the expected payout as collateral. Elise was livid. It means she was counting on the court siding with her. This wasn't about mourning. It was about monetizing grief. The creditors tried to come after me. After all, the money they were promised now belonged to me. But Elise handled them like wolves on leashes. She reminded them of the ruling, the abuse, the restraining order, and they backed off quickly. One lender even issued a written apology. Meanwhile, Swim lost her condo. She moved into a small rental outside the city under a different name. According to David Costa's final report, she started using her maiden name again and applied for a string of low-level jobs. Nothing stuck. Nobody wanted to hire the woman whose name was tied to one of the most talked-about military spouse scandals of the last 5 years. Eventually, she disappeared from public life altogether. Some said she moved out of state. Others whispered she'd gone back to her parents. But no one cared enough to check. The legacy she tried to manipulate turned against her. And Rick? His name was now on the Wall of Honor at the Air Force Academy, right below the words, "Service is not just action. It is integrity under pressure." I visited the wall once, in spring, laid a hand against the smooth metal and just stood there in silence. A few cadets passed by. One recognized me. "You're his mom, aren't you?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "He's a legend here," the cadet said. "They talk about him in ethics class." And I smiled. Because legends last longer than lies. Months passed. The seasons changed. Life settled. Then, one quiet October afternoon, a package arrived at my door. No return address. Just my name, Ginger Holloway, typed cleanly on the label. Inside was a small bundle wrapped in cloth, tied with twine. Tucked between the folds was a single sheet of paper. "Found this in a storage unit. Figured you should have it." No name. No context. Just that. Inside the bundle were 2 things. A worn Polaroid of Rick and Swim in happier times, before the fights, before the spiral, and a torn journal page, clearly ripped from a larger notebook. It was Swim's handwriting. The slant, the loops, unmistakable. I read it once. Then again. It wasn't dated. But it sounded like it was written in the weeks before Rick's death. He looks at me like I'm a ghost. Like someone he doesn't recognize anymore. I scream to be heard, but he just goes quiet. The quieter he gets, the louder I get. And now it's like he's already gone. I keep thinking, if I yell loud enough, maybe he'll come back. But I think I broke something I can't fix. That was it. No apology. No name. No admission. But it was the closest thing to remorse I'd ever seen from her. I sat with it for a long time. Not because I forgave her, because I didn't. But because I finally understood something important. She didn't win. But she also didn't escape. She had to live with what she did. Even if she never said the words, that note was her ghost. A quiet confession she probably never intended anyone to see. Maybe she tossed it away. Maybe it got lost in a move. But now it was in my hands. And I decided to do the only thing Rick would have wanted. I placed it in a small wooden box with the other mementos from his life: flight badges, old letters, a model airplane he built as a teen. Then I locked it. Not to forget, but because some truths don't need to be broadcast to the world, they just need to be known. And I knew. That was enough. About a year after the court case ended, I received another letter. This time, it came from a name I didn't recognize, Leah V., with a return address in New Mexico. Inside was a photograph. A young boy, maybe 6, sitting in a backyard, clutching a toy fighter jet. He had dark blonde hair, serious eyes, and something heartbreakingly familiar in the shape of his smile. The letter read, "Dear Mrs. Holloway, you don't know me, but I knew your son, Rick. Briefly. We met during his final deployment training rotation. I was stationed nearby with a logistics unit. It wasn't serious. We talked, we shared coffee, and then we lost touch. I never told him about James. I didn't want to complicate his life. But my son deserves to know where he came from. And I thought you should know too. I'm not asking for anything. Just letting you know that a piece of him still lives." I stared at the photo for a long time. James. My grandson. The boy Rick never knew he had. Elise was the first person I called. Not for legal help, just to talk it through. "Should I reach out?" I asked. "Would that be intrusive?" She was quiet for a moment. "Rick's gone, Ginger. But this child, he's part of him. And maybe he needs a little truth too." So I wrote back. Not to claim, not to demand, not to correct. Just to say, I would love to meet him. Only if and when you're ready. Weeks passed. Then came another envelope. This one had a plane ticket. Albuquerque. Leah invited me for a weekend visit. And when I stepped off the plane, nervous and breathless, I saw him, James, standing next to her, holding a little handmade sign that said, "Hi, Grandma Ginger." I dropped to my knees. And he ran into my arms like he'd known me his whole life. James was quiet at first. Polite. Observant. He had the same tilt of the head Rick had when he was trying to understand someone, the same habit of tapping his fingers on his knee when thinking. Leah had done a beautiful job raising him. Their home was modest but warm, filled with books and sunlight, with a small garden in the back where James had planted tomatoes and marigolds. The second night of my visit, he asked the question I'd been dreading. Was my dad a good guy? We were sitting outside, watching the sun dip low over the hills. I took a breath, and I told him the truth. "James," I said softly, "your father was one of the best men I've ever known. He was brave, kind, loyal. He helped people, even when he was hurting. Even when he was tired. And he loved hard. That's who he was." James nodded slowly. "He was a pilot, right?" "He was. One of the best." He was quiet again for a moment. Then he looked at me with those serious eyes. "Why doesn't Mom talk about him?" I hesitated. "She didn't know him for very long," I said gently. "And sometimes, when grown-ups have complicated feelings, they think it's easier not to talk at all." He considered that. Then nodded, as if accepting the weight of it without needing the full truth. "I didn't tell him about Swim. Not yet. That part of Rick's story would come later, when James was older, when he could understand that sometimes people hurt others not because they're evil, but because they're broken. Instead, I gave him something else. A small wooden box. Inside was a photo of Rick in uniform, a pair of his pilot wings, and the model jet Rick built as a boy, restored and polished. James opened it carefully, his eyes wide. This was his. "It was," I said. "Now it's yours." He hugged me then. Tightly. Without words. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't felt since before the funeral. Hope. Rick may have been taken too soon. But his story, his real story, wasn't over. It was flying forward, carried in the hands of a little boy who already knew how to look to the sky. When I returned home, something had changed. The silence that had once been suffocating now felt peaceful. The house was still filled with memories, Rick's laughter echoing faintly from the corners, the scent of old books and worn wood, but now it didn't hurt to breathe. The insurance payout had never been touched. I hadn't needed it. I'd lived frugally all my life. Rick used to tease me about reusing Ziploc bags. Now, that thriftiness gave me freedom. I spoke to Elise about setting up a trust, not for myself, not even for James directly, but for something Rick would have believed in. She helped me create the Captain Holloway Memorial Fund, a scholarship for children of military families affected by psychological abuse or trauma. We kept it quiet at first. No press releases. No interviews. Just letters to the base, the academy, and a few veteran support groups. Applications poured in. Stories too familiar. Too raw. One boy whose father never recovered after a combat tour, and whose mother worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat. A girl whose brother died by suicide after years of silent suffering under an emotionally violent relationship. Rick's name became a lifeline. And the fund became more than money, it became a beacon. Meanwhile, James and I started writing letters. Actual letters, not emails. I'd send him stories about Rick's childhood, little drawings of planes and squirrels, and our infamous backyard cherry pie disaster. He'd write back with sketches of his own, questions about piloting, and occasional Lego blueprints for a new kind of jet. I started keeping his letters in the drawer where Rick's used to go. And the house, once so quiet, started to sing again. One afternoon, while cleaning out a cabinet, I found an old voicemail I'd accidentally saved from Rick. It was short. "Hey, Mom. Just checking in. I know I say it a lot, but thank you. For always being steady. For being my lighthouse. Love you." I pressed play 3 times. Then I smiled and filed it away. Not because I needed to hear it again, but because it reminded me who I'd been to him when it mattered most. It was a gray, windless morning when I visited Rick's grave again. I didn't go often. Not because I didn't care, but because I carried him with me daily. In my chest, in my spine, in every breath that came with pain and passed with grace. But this morning was different. I brought fresh lilies, his favorite, and one of James' drawings, a fighter jet with a bright red stripe and a note in crayon, "Fly safe, Dad." As I approached the headstone, I saw her. Swim. Older. Thinner. The sharpness in her face dulled by time and wear. She wore a plain black coat and carried nothing. Just stood there. For a second, I considered walking away. But then I remembered Rick's words, "You win with truth." So I stepped forward. She didn't turn. Didn't flinch. Just said, "Without looking, I wondered if you'd come." "I usually don't," I replied. "But James wanted his drawing here." Her head tilted slightly. "You met him?" "Yes," I said. Silence. Then, in a voice almost too small to hear, "I wasn't supposed to become what I did. I didn't start off angry. I just couldn't stop myself." I didn't respond. She went on, still not looking at me. "I loved him. But it was a kind of love that needed to win. Needed to own. I hated how calm he was. It made me feel invisible." The wind stirred a bit. She shivered. "I blamed you. Because you were safe. He felt safe with you. And I couldn't understand why I wasn't enough." Still, I said nothing. Because nothing she said could excuse it. But some things didn't need answers. Just endings. She turned to me finally. Her eyes weren't tearful. Just hollow. "I read what you did. The fund. The speeches. The ruling. You told his story." "I told the truth," I said quietly. She nodded once. "Thank you." Then she walked away. No apologies. No dramatic collapse. Just a woman retreating from the wreckage she caused, finally aware that she could never undo it. I stayed another hour. Planted the lilies. Tucked James' drawing beneath the stone. And whispered into the wind. "He sees you now, Rick. He knows who you were. And nothing will ever erase that." James turned 8 the year I took him to the airfield. It wasn't anything grand, just a local aviation museum with a small hangar and a few vintage jets. But to James, it was magic. His eyes lit up as he ran between the exhibits, asking 1,000 questions, some of which I couldn't answer but promised we'd learn together. At one point, he climbed into a retired cockpit simulator. The guide smiled and let him pretend to fly. He sat there, hands gripping the controls, lips pursed in concentration. Then he looked at me and said, "Do you think Dad used to feel this free up here?" I paused. "Yes," I said. "I think it was the only place he ever truly did." James nodded solemnly, like he already knew. Back home, he started building planes again, out of wood, paper, Legos, even foil. And I kept every single one in a long wooden display rack we made together, marked Fleet Holloway. Each had a name: the Steady Wing, Quiet Hawk, Captain Calm, and my favorite, the Lighthouse. Meanwhile, the fund grew. A donor, anonymous at first, matched the endowment. Then 2 more joined. One of them turned out to be a former academy instructor who had taught Rick. In an email, he wrote, "Your son was quiet strength, and now his legacy is louder than any tragedy." We expanded the program into mentorship. Cadets partnered with younger students from military families impacted by trauma, boys like James, girls like the ones I'd once read about in case files. Rick's name became a story not of how he died, but how he inspired healing. One day, James asked if I'd ever flown. I laughed. "I get nervous just stepping on a commercial flight." He grinned. "Then maybe I'll take you up one day." "I'll hold you to that," I said. We pinky swore, serious business between us. That night, I lit a candle in Rick's memory. And this time, I didn't pray for justice or answers. I prayed for wind beneath James' wings. For peace that stayed. For a story no one would need to rewrite because it had already been told the right way. Years passed. James grew into a young man, tall, broad-shouldered, with Rick's posture and Leah's quick wit. At 16, he started his first job at the local airport, refueling planes and shadowing mechanics. He never said it outright, but I knew what he was aiming for. Air Force Academy. Same as his father. Leah and I supported him quietly. No pressure. Just presence. But I kept one last piece of Rick locked away, a sealed folder marked confidential, final deployment archive. I had never opened it. It had arrived from the Department of Defense after the reclassification of Rick's death. Inside, it said, were the full logs of Rick's final mission, his psychological reviews, cockpit footage, and a transcript of the classified debrief filed posthumously. I had kept it sealed for years, afraid that one more truth might shatter the peace I'd built. But now, James deserved to see every part of his father. One rainy afternoon, I invited him over, just the 2 of us. I placed the folder on the table between us and said, "This is everything they didn't tell the world. It's yours now." He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "Only if you read it with me." So we opened it. Page by page, line by line. Rick's final days came alive, his schedule, his physical condition, his mental state. One file described a private conversation Rick had with a superior officer, in which he confessed he was running on fumes and afraid to stop because he didn't know what would be waiting in the silence. There was cockpit audio too. Moments before the crash, Rick's voice was clear. Focused. No panic. No fear. He was calm. Even as systems failed. Even as the ground drew close. He steered away from a populated zone. He took the long fall to save others. His last words on the tape? "Tell my mom she was right about everything." James didn't cry. Neither did I. We just sat in silence, the weight of those words folding around us like wings. Later that evening, James stood at the window watching the rain. "I'm going to make them remember him, Grandma." "They already do," I whispered. "But yes, do it anyway." And I knew then, with absolute certainty, Rick's story was never just a tragedy. It was a call sign. One his son would carry skyward. James was accepted into the Air Force Academy at 18. Top of his class in physics. Letters of recommendation from former instructors who remembered Rick. And a personal essay that stunned the review board. In it, he wrote, "I was born from silence. From the space between screaming and breaking. My father didn't die in combat. He died from emotional warfare. But he chose grace until the very end. That's the man I want to become." He didn't mention swim. He didn't need to. He mentioned me once. She taught me that truth isn't about revenge. It's about memory. And memory deserves protection. The day he received his acceptance letter, he came straight to my house. Held it in both hands like a relic. "I got in," he said, tears brimming. I hugged him tight. We walked to Rick's headstone together that weekend. James stood in uniform, ceremonial whites, clean-cut, proud. And then he read aloud the words he'd written for his induction ceremony. "I request the call sign Lighthouse, in honor of Captain Richard Holloway, who guided others through darkness without ever asking to be seen." The officer standing beside him, a retired pilot who'd flown with Rick once, granted it on the spot. "Approved. You'll carry that name well." James placed his academy coin at Rick's grave, then stood at attention and saluted. It was the proudest moment of my life. Not because my grandson followed his father's path, but because he did it with full knowledge of the pain, the silence, the cost, and walked forward anyway. With eyes open, with heart steady, with a light that couldn't be dimmed. Back at home, I placed a new frame on the wall. A photo of James in uniform, Rick's pilot wings pinned to his chest. Below it, a plaque that read, "He didn't just survive the storm. He became the guide for others through it." The last letter I wrote to Rick wasn't mailed. It sits in my bedside drawer, folded carefully, ink slightly smudged at the corners. "My son, you were right to trust me with your truth. I carried it. I fought for it. And now it's etched in the lives you never got to meet, in the boy you never got to hold, in the cadets who walked taller because of your story. They remember. She tried to steal your ending, but I rewrote it. And now every time James looks to the sky, he doesn't see a void. He sees you. Love, Mom." I never remarried. Never moved from the house Rick built with his own hands. And I never stopped setting out 2 cups of tea each morning, mine and his. It's a ritual, not a habit. A way of saying, you're still here. I didn't let them bury you in lies. The scholarship now funds over 30 students a year. The mentorship program has been adopted by 3 other bases. And James, call sign Lighthouse, graduated top of his class. He flies now. He writes often. Each letter ends the same. "I saw the clouds open today. It felt like coming home." As for Swim, her name faded. Her story, the distorted one, dried up without attention. She no longer has the stage. She has only silence. The very thing she feared most. And me? I sit by the window most mornings, watching the horizon. Some days, I swear I hear a jet far above, low and steady. When I do, I close my eyes.
My grandmother told me this story. Thanks for watching this video, like and subscribe. Bye bye!